Hi,
Okay.
welcome to Fiberchats. My name is Irina. I'm the host here. And today I'm very excited to introduce you to a Canadian designer. Well, we'll get back to that. I don't know if you are really a Canadian designer, but you live in Canada right now. And Andrea Rangel, I said it right.
Andrea Rangel, that's pretty close.
Close enough.
Yeah,
Hi.
definitely.
Welcome to my channel. It's great to have
Thank you.
Well,
Thanks so much for hosting me.
so the main reason we are meeting today is this baby. So you're about to publish this book. It's not even yet out there. It's about to be released on the 10th, right? October 10th,
Yes, October 10th.
2023. So I was lucky enough to be one of the few people in the world who got to see the copy of it before it was even released. And I must tell you, like, I immediately jumped into designing a hat. Because I saw a Scorpio there and I was like, that would be so perfect. I was looking for a picture of a Scorpio and now I can put it in the hat, like any generic hat design, and suddenly it's going to be like mine, customized.
That's the exact reaction that I was hoping for. So thank you. I'm very honored and grateful to hear that was what you did first thing.
Well, before we go into the whole, like, I want to make it very interesting conversation for me today, because I want to talk about like what constitutes original design and how people can use your knitting dictionary for that purpose, right? But before we go into that, tell me a little bit about how you started knitting, and tell me, like, when I said that, I don't know if you are Canadian, you were actually born in Peru and then you lived in the US. So what do you consider yourself?
I am Canadian because I have Canadian citizenship. So I've lived in Canada for about 10 years. So I do have Canadian citizenship. I also have US citizenship because my parents are Americans. And so I was an American by virtue of that. And I also, I was born in Peru. And so I have Peruvian citizenship because Peru is on my birth certificate. And I lived there until I was 8 years old. So I definitely have a childhood memory there. But I'm pretty much Canadian at this point. I have the US and the Canadian passports, but not the Peruvian. So I'm working on my Spanish, but it's slow going.
I mean, Peru is like very rich in crafting history in general and knitting specifically. Do you think your knitting journey was influenced by that somehow?
Actually, no. I'm right up front going to say that it was not, because I grew up in the rainforest. So the part, right, there's like a river, or, the Amazon River, and then I grew up on a lake right near the river. And so the fiber tradition is really in the mountains in Peru. And I did visit Lima and I got to see those things, and I saw the sweaters and the knitting and the hats and all of that. But it didn't really connect for me because that was not really part of my Peruvian upbringing, despite the country. I've never been to Machu Picchu. I mean, discovering sort of what it means to me to have that heritage and relationship with Peru is sort of an ongoing process for me. So I would say no, the knitting was not connected there, although I do really admire the fiber traditions in Peru now that I'm an adult. I didn't learn to knit, so you asked me about like my knitting journey, so I guess I'll segue there, because I didn't learn to knit until my family moved to the States. And my grandmother was a knitter and a crocheter, and she taught me how to do my first stitches, and she made these gorgeous blankets and velcros for me. And so I knitted a little bit, but she actually died when I was pretty young, so that connection kind of faded for me, and I didn't like get to really go back and visit with her and increase my knitting, because I was just a kid. I would think I was 8 or 9 when I learned to knit. But then when I went to college, my auntie was knitting. And when I saw that, I just wanted to try again. And so she gave me some of her yarn and needles, and I put it in my hands, and my hands just started going.
It's so funny because like it's the same thing with me. Like I learned to knit. My grandmother taught me to knit. I was also like 7 or 8, something like this. And it was a couple of weeks actually that she was teaching me to knit. And then I never touched the needles until I was an adult. But when I did touch the needles, it was like some sort of like physical memory, like
It's like
muscle memory.
in the hands. It wasn't even, I couldn't think about how to do it. If I tried to like look and think about how to do it, like my auntie is a picker, and so she tried to teach me to do that, but I had learned throwing. And so like I kind of just like closed my eyes and put my yarn in my other hand, and they just started going. So now I do both ways, picking and throwing, mostly picking, but it is very fascinating how the body remembered. I feel like it was much more of a physical memory than a mental memory. So it's like my body remembered. And then starting then, I just have not stopped knitting since then. So that's been a long time, I guess like 20-ish years since I was in college, 20 more.
Do you remember some of your first projects? Do you remember like when you were started?
Yeah, my auntie was just really, she's a wonderful knitter and really generous. My Aunt Kathy, cheers to her, because she helped me a lot when I was a new knitter. And she opened her stash and was just like, what do you want? And I had no idea because I knew nothing about yarn or fiber. But I saw this purple mohair. It was like, I would say probably a fingering weight, very fuzzy, but it wasn't like one of those super shiny silk mohairs. I think it was just mohair. And she had just like a huge quantity of it. I don't know, 15 skeins or something. And I was like, oh, I love this. Because it was like dark purple, very moody. And she was like, well, sure. I'm not really using that. So she just like gave it all to me and some knitting needles, some metal, like long straight knitting needles. And that's what I cast on with. And I mean, it was the worst, obviously, the absolute worst yarn for a beginner,
Right.
Because, you couldn't see the stitches. If you dropped one, it was gone forever. You couldn't frog it. But I just like started knitting, and I made this rectangle that just kind of like went all over the place. I couldn't remember. I would stop in the middle of a row and have no idea which direction I was supposed to go back. And so then it just like, it had short row shaping with holes and dropped stitches and added stitches. And
you were a designer
like,
from the beginning. You just didn't know that you were designing, right?
Well, I guess so, because I made this misshapen rectangle and then I cut out some canvas. I also did not know how to sew, but I like probably got it from like a thrift store jacket or something. And I cut out some canvas and then I just whip stitched probably this misshapen mohair monstrosity to the canvas. And then I sewed it together and I made a little strap, and I carried all my heavy books in that for college. It was like this hideous, awful thing, but I just loved it. And it actually didn't fall apart. It actually somehow managed, because I did the whole thing by hand. But that's the first project that I really remember, was that I carried that yarn around forever. I didn't know what I was making. And it turned out to be a very ugly satchel that I loved very much.
How did you go from like learning how to knit, improving on how to knit, to announcing to the world that you're a designer?
I really did like to make my own patterns. And of course, we didn't have Ravelry when I started doing these things. I mean, there were a few blogs, and I think some of the very first things were out there. There was Knitty, which was the main source where I got patterns. And then like Isolde had started selling PDFs, which I just was like, that was brand new. She did an amazing job at like kind of like starting an industry, I feel like. But I was bad at pattern reading, and I was not, I guess I wasn't super interested in learning because I was kind of impatient with that process. And so I just like made things up. And most of the things that I made did not turn out how I pictured and were not what I would consider good in any way. And it was like a lot of thrift store yarn, a lot of like Michael's yarn that I like used and just kind of messed around with. And I tried making clothes, like I really wanted to make sweaters, but they mostly like did not fit or like had weird things. All my armholes were too small. So I always somehow managed to like make these things that just like cut into my underarms in the most uncomfortable way. And so I played around, and finally I became kind of impatient with the fact that all of the things I was making were not really that good. And so then I started following patterns. And I did go to Knitty, and that kind of like taught me how a knitting pattern works. And I was a teacher as my first job, or as like out of college, that's what I was trained for, was K-8 education. And so then I thought like, oh, I'm really good at knitting, even though my design stuff was kind of, mediocre. So I thought I might teach knitting at some local yarn shops. But I wanted to teach like how to make socks. And of course, it didn't occur to me to like, we'll all buy this pattern and then we'll knit from it. It was like, I have to make a pattern for us to make socks from. And so then I started writing patterns for teaching knitting. And I quickly discovered that it was very hard to make a pattern that didn't have a mistake in it when I just wrote it out in Microsoft Word. And so I found that like exhausting and frustrating, that like, just like my previous work that I had, like my improvised designs, my improvised patterns were also like kind of not systematic and had problems in them. So it was a pretty long period of me learning about like editing and all of that, and like how do patterns work, and like knitting from a lot of other people's patterns, finally learning about gauge. Like the longest time I did not apply the concept of gauge to my knitting at all. I mean, probably at least 5 years, I was just like,
What
which
can
is
possibly
why
go
nothing
wrong, right?
yeah, and nothing worked out. Like my projects did not work out. So I just do not recommend that. But I was so obsessed, I just kept going. Even though things, like a lot of things did not work out for me, I don't know, I was very obsessed. And then I did write a simple rectangular lace stole, like shawl, scarf type thing. And I submitted it. My partner took pictures of me in his parents' backyard, and I submitted it to Knitty, and it got on the cover of Knitty in the fall of 2009. So that would be my first, like, hey, I'm making knitting patterns. But I was still teaching at that time, and I did not envision that as like a job. I didn't understand how it could be a job. I tried asking sort of like at the local yarn store, like, how do people make a job out of this? And I don't know if I asked the question quite clearly enough, or like maybe they didn't know, but I just like, it took me a long time to learn all about like just the nuts and bolts, because I tried looking up like, can I go to college for this? Like, is there like a certification program? Like, how do I learn how to do this? And I couldn't find anything. It really ended up being a lot of trial and error and asking people who were generous enough to tell me their experience. And I would say that 2009 pattern was my first published. And then I started designing full-time in 2012, I think, because we moved to Canada in 2012 and I didn't get another job. So like, I just went, once we moved for my partner's work. And once we got here, I decided not to get another job and just like see what would happen if I did this full time.
Did you ever regret that decision?
No. I will say it took a long time for it to be a job that is like a regular job. Like at this point, it's a regular job for me. As far as like, if I wanted to re-enter normal employment, it would probably be hard for me to find a job that like was an equivalent salary for me for what I'm doing now. But that took a long time. I mean, I would say like when my first Stitch Dictionary alternate came out in 2017, that was a big turnaround moment for me, or that was like the time period when things started coming together. So my partner and I mean, we lived frugally. We don't have children, and it was mostly his income that was supporting us for several years. So that's a thing. I mean, that's a lot of businesses are like that. Either you need funding. I mean, you need funding from somewhere to start a business. So if you have a partner, that's your funding. Who has an income, that's your funding. Otherwise, like other businesses get loans in order to like establish themselves, because mostly they're not profitable within the first 5 years. And this business is not different than that. That's normal. And that was my expectation.
Tell me about the first book. Like, how was the idea of that first Stitch Dictionary born? Like, what made you want to write that kind of book, not just a book of your patterns, but a Stitch Dictionary?
I'm pretty sure it was my partner's idea. He's an artist, or was trained as an artist in college, and he had helped me with color work motifs in the past. Like sometimes I would have an idea and I might work on it a little bit, and then he might work on it a little bit. And so he had created color work for me in the past, and I think he was tired of the snowflakes, like traditional snowflakes. He's like, I see the same snowflake everywhere. I'll bet we can make a better snowflake. And then he started thinking about like, what if we made a book with all kinds of color work? Because like there's all these ideas that we have, and they're more, or there's a lot of books about traditional motifs, and those are really cool, and I think they're really important. And like if you're interested in traditional color work motifs, like Mary Jane Mucklestone's books are so good, and they were very inspiring to us. But we thought like there seems to be an opening for motifs that nobody has really seen before, maybe ones that haven't really been collected, or things that are like not traditional. And so I thought about that, and that seemed like a pretty cool idea. And I do enjoy color work a lot. I like diving deep into different topics in knitting. So color work is what I've written books about, but actually I love like lace, I love cables, I love simple knitting, I love just knitting a plain vanilla sock. So I love kind of all the things about knitting. But one thing that is fun for me is taking time to just really dive into one topic.
Right.
So that was, the first book was really a color work journey. It's, I mean, both of the Stitch Dictionaries are just stranded color work. So we wanted to be really niche. It's not a Stitch Dictionary that has like lace motifs or cables or anything like that. It's just not even intarsia, not even mosaic. It's just stranded color work. And we did that so that we could really have an expansive look into this one kind of smallish topic, which turns out to be a huge topic. And then I do actually have a first book, which was just patterns, called Rugged Knits. And that book was with Interweave. And because I had a prior relationship with them, then I was able to take my proposal to my editor from before and say like, hey, we're interested in doing this. And what was cool about that was I worked with Carrie Bogert, who also did the editing on KnitOvation. She's sort of like packaged the whole thing. She did the whole project. She's a very organized and skilled person. And she helped me to refine my proposal before she took it to her team. So we went back and forth on like how the Stitch Dictionary would work, what it would look like, what the proposal would look like. And then she took it to her team, and that's how we got that first one. And then later, Interweave is now owned by Penguin Random House, and so it was a little bit of a different process. But but yeah, that was the first time. Carrie helped me a lot. And then the second time I kind of had a little bit more tools since I had done it before.
Right.
So.
Well, what I love about the KnitOvation, and I looked through, I mean, I studied this book. I went like cover to cover. So
Thank you.
Part where you give directions of how to design your own sweater, the one you're wearing actually right now.
Yeah.
Hat and a pair of mittens. And to me, that was brilliant because it was like, it made designing something easy, right? Because like we all terrified about grading things. And when it comes to adding color work on top of it, it makes it that much more complicated. And you made it easy for anyone who has this book to sit down and without even knitting it, design your own sweater, hat, or mittens. As soon as I told on my channel, because we're running the giveaway and we're gonna do soon, we're gonna pick a winner for this giveaway. So as soon as I announced this giveaway, I got questions. Well, if I take motif from the book and I insert it into this rubric that you made to create your own item, does that make it my design, or is it Andrea's design? Like, what's your response? What's your thinking on this?
I get this question a lot, and people seem very attached to what makes it my design and what makes it someone else's design. And I'm a little bit less attached to that. For one thing, I'll say right off that, like, if you want to use the motifs in the book to make a knitting pattern that you then sell, that is like what it's for. So yes, absolutely. The restriction is no copy pasting. So what's in the book, the images and all of that, that's copyright protected. That's like in my intellectual property and that of my publisher. So if you were to like take a picture of a chart in my book and then put that into a PDF, that would be stealing. But if you're to make your own chart from just like looking at it and then create your own format, that is fine. So the copy paste thing extends to the text of my pattern. So I wrote a pattern and it has numbers and directions and all of that. So if you wanted to make a sweater that was just like this one, this is the one from the book. And if you wanted to make this, but you wanted to put a different chart in the yoke, that's what the instructions in the book tell you how to do. That's very encouraged, which makes it like your adaptation. But if you were to take the text that's written there, say you have a PDF and you copied and you pasted that and you put that into a PDF and you just put your chart there and then you sold that, that would be also intellectual property theft, because the text, the words that are written, those are my creation. But if you were to like say, oh, I love this idea, I want to make a top-down yoke sweater with that similar wedge shape, and then you went, you wrote your own spreadsheet and wrote your own words, and then you created that, that's yours, that you can sell. Now, most knitters aren't needing to like really know the answer to this, because most people aren't going to be selling a written pattern.
Right.
Like that's mostly not the majority of people want to make a sweater for themselves. They want to make it for their friend. And if you're making a sweater for yourself or for your friend, then it doesn't really matter. I'm in collaboration with all the knitters who make my work. And so I love when people make modifications and they change things, and like the things that we create are our own individual unique creations. You know, like I love to sew as well. And every time I make a sewing pattern, I make changes. You know, I like make it smaller here, bigger there. I cut it out and all these things. And then I make myself a pair of pants. And that pair of pants is my own unique creation. But the pattern, like,
Helped.
so like, that's not really mine, but I definitely made changes to it. So I'm not gonna like go share my pattern pieces with the public or sell them. But I can use them as much as I want for myself. And if I had a friend over and they were like, had the same measurements as me, like having them trace my pattern, maybe I'd kind of want them to buy the original pattern first. But like if they wanted to like do similar changes as me and we were sharing, you know, they should buy the sewing pattern first. But
okay, let me take you further, a little bit deeper into that. So let's say I bought your book. And by the way, thank you to the Penguin House for sending me this book for free.
Yeah.
And I open the book on random page and I see a random design. And I'm thinking, you know what? I'm just going to make a beanie and put this design all over the brim there, right? Would you consider that to be my design? Like if I choose my yarn, if I'll do the swatch, if I'll do all the calculations, if I'll put it all together, writing the pattern, would that be your eyes, would be my design? Or would you expect the collaboration mentioning that I used your stitch dictionary?
It's not required. I love to know when people use the motifs from my designs because it's really cool and I like to share that, but it is not required. So I'm sure there are other opinions about this, but my understanding of how a stitch dictionary works is that the point is that people use the motifs in their own work, whatever that work is for. So if you have the Barbara Walker stitch dictionaries, maybe you have some of those cool ones from Nora Gone. You use the chart, you make your own formatting, you do your own Excel spreadsheet, and you input it. It's a tool. So it's like a palette. It's like if you're painting a painting, like nobody owns blue. You know, like the company sold you this tube of blue paint, but when you paint the paint onto your canvas, then like that is your piece of art. So that's how I consider stitch dictionaries to work, is that they provide tools, just like nobody owns like the knit stitch or the purl stitch. Like these motifs that we create, the idea of a stitch dictionary is that designers and knitters are able to use those in their own work. And in my opinion, there's no credit necessary when even if you publish something like that. Like I've used Barbara Walker many times. I've used Nora Gone's stitch patterns many times. And I'll probably mention like, oh, this motif is from this book, maybe in my blog post or something. But in my opinion, those are like tools. They are materials for design work, and they are not required to be credited. It's your work if you've done the grading, if you've chosen the yarn, if you've written all the text yourself. You know, those are the markers of like, if we're talking about for publication, it's totally different, of course, than for just your own use. When it's for your own use, it doesn't, in my opinion, really matter. But if it's for publication, then that's more important. So, but yeah, I encourage the point of the stitch dictionaries is like, yes, use the motifs. Just don't copy my text and don't take a photo of the charts. Make your own charts. But yeah, that's my philosophy.
When you see somebody wearing something that they design, they came up with using your stitch dictionary, how does it feel?
My first reaction is that mine? And then I'm like, oh, they used it. And then I get quite excited that people use it, and I show my partner, and I often will share it. It's a very cool feeling, because I do feel like if I make one knitting pattern, like, yes, there will be people who make it, and that is really cool. That is like a collaboration between me and knitters, because like I've offered them instructions and then they've like made it their own, which is really cool. But it's another step altogether when someone takes a motif and then is like very creative with it. Or I mean, maybe even not that creative with it. Maybe just like you said, put it on a hat. That actually takes a lot of skill, because there's a lot of math involved in that. And there's like the gauge, and there's like getting the color work to look right, choosing the right yarn. And if you want it in multiple sizes, getting like the repeats proper is quite challenging. So I think people are quite quick to dismiss things that seem simple, because it might be that, okay, yeah, oh, you just slapped it on a hat. But that's not what happened. You spent hours probably, and if you didn't plan it, then, and you just kind of like did a little I'm gonna wing it, then what are the chances it came out properly the way that you wanted it? Low. So the more effort that you put in at the beginning, in the planning stage, the chances are higher that it will actually work out in the end. And so the amount of effort that goes into like writing a very simple pattern, especially if it's easy to follow, is immense. So I think people are way too quick to just be like, oh, that's not original. I don't care about original. This is fashion. Like, we all have, I mean, most people have the arms, the legs, the torso, you know, like how many ways can you change something to fit like a human body? It's just very, I'm comfortable with the idea that in fashion, there's a lot of knockoffs, and you take an idea and then transform it a tiny bit. So I'm pretty thrilled when people use my motifs, and I also am very respectful of the amount of effort and intellectual labor that it takes, and knowledge and skill that it takes to do even the simplest. Even if you are making a cowl that's a tube and it's just a repeat of the, like, even that takes a lot of skill and effort. And I have a lot of admiration for people doing that. And I do not think that it's just anything. It's very impressive and it takes a lot. So,
well, let me ask, talking about effort, right? There are over 150 colorwork motifs in there. How many of them did you actually need? Did you need all of them?
Yes, I knit all of them, and for my previous book, I knit them all. I had considered trying to like get a knitting machine or hire people to help me. But one thing is that I really like to knit, so I didn't really want to let it go. But also I needed perfection in a way that's really unreasonable for almost any other kind of knitting project, because of the way that these are photographed. So the level of quality control that I felt like I needed to have over the work was just, it felt much more intimidating to me to try to work with other people on getting what I wanted, even though, not to diminish anyone else's skill, and I know there are so many good sample knitters out there, but it made me feel more comfortable and in control of the process to do it all myself. And I gave myself much more time for the second book than I did for the first book, because I learned that I needed more time. So I negotiated to have as much time as I needed.
Well, describe me your day, because to need 150 of these samples, and I'm sure that sometimes you create a chart and you think it's going to be brilliant, and then you need to understand.
And then we chuck it. Yeah, right. There were a lot that we chucked. Absolutely. In both books, we did not keep everything, because, you know, my partner would come up with a cool chart, and then once we saw it knitted, we just, or it was maybe really unpleasant to knit, or we didn't like what it looked like. Either way, we both had to agree that we liked it enough to be included in the book. And so there were a lot that got, that were not included. So you were asking about what's my day like?
Right. Like, how much time do you have? Like, you saying this is a career, you're saying this is a full-time job. So
yeah,
you like tell me like your day-to-day kind of schedule, and when do you have time to knit for yourself or just for fun or for pleasure at this point?
I have worked on my schedule over a long period of time. I've been designing professionally for over 10 years. And especially at the first 5 years, and a little bit even further than that, I would say through the finishing of my alternate, I was working all the time. So like get up in the morning, eat breakfast, start working, and that would be knitting or working on the computer, maybe writing a pattern or working on email, customer support, that sort of thing, photo editing, whatever. And then I would have like meals through the day, but literally work until I went to bed. I was working all the time when I was a newer designer, and it was very hard on like physically. I got pain in my elbows and my hands, and I would, when I was working on alternate, I would have to like soak my arms up past the elbows in a sink full of ice water most days, which is a signal that that's not sustainable. And so once that book was finished, it gave me a moment to pause and kind of rethink like how I was gonna live my life. And I think, I mean, before that I did get out, like I would go for hikes with my partner and things like that. Like we love to bicycle, so we would do that like on the weekends and things like that. But the majority of my time was spent working. So after that book, Alternate, was finished, then I just like rethought things, and I decided to try what would happen if I worked a 9-to-5 type schedule 5 days a week and see if like I could continue to do enough work in that amount of time. And like most people who have tried that sort of thing discover, yeah, it was way more productive to do it that way, and more enjoyable. And my life is far better. So that's my schedule now, and it's not 9-to-5. I get up 6:15ish, yoga, breakfast, and then I start work, I don't know, 7ish. And my days look really different depending on what's necessary that day. I do knit during work hours, but I do knit. That's the one exception to my like, I don't work after my partner comes home from his day job. The one exception is I do knit a lot, and that's because I really like it. And it's, as long as I have already written all the instructions out for myself, or I'm knitting from somebody else's pattern or something like that, then it's stress relief. Like most knitters know, it's quite enjoyable. So I'll knit during the day sometimes, and then I will knit in the evening. But other than that, like I rarely do emails when in my off hours. There are some exceptions, but I'm pretty much I'll respond in 3 to 5 business days type of person. And Instagram is a little looser. I sometimes respond to Instagram comments in off hours, especially if I feel like a post is doing well and I want to, like, you know, help my marketing, which is a really, really important part of my job. The design is important, but the marketing takes up just as much time in order for people to know that I exist. So I do sometimes do a little bit of social media on off hours. But
talking of marketing, I announced the giveaway of this book because the Penguin production, they send me 1 copy for me and 1 copy to give away to my listeners. So you guys got super lucky, and I get to keep my copy. And today we're gonna pick the winner of this giveaway. So without further ado, here is the random comment generator.
Congratulations to the winner. I hope you love your book, and get some sticky notes ready for marking your favorite motifs.
And please email me to fiberchats@gmail.com with your name and your address, and I'm gonna make sure that you receive this book in the mail. Thank you so much to Penguin, and thank you, Andrea, for writing this beautiful book. So is there like the 3rd one in the making already?
No. I mean, I guess that's possible sometime in the future, but there was 5 years in between, I guess 6 years in between publishing the 2 books, and that seemed like a decent amount of time. So I'm working on independent design at this point. I've got a sweater pattern that is with my editor right now, and that's what I'll be working on for a little while. But I mean, who knows? I didn't plan on doing a second one, so.
Well, but let me ask you about this, because there's like such a variety of motifs here. There are some like really funky, like there's crabs and umbrellas and snakes, and some are like really classy, like the waves and the snowflakes. So when the idea pops to mind, what do you do? Do you write it down? Do you sketch it? Do you immediately run to your partner and tell him, start working on that one? Like, how does it work?
It really depends. Yeah, my design process does not work the same way every time. So sometimes I see a motif and I think like, that's the one, I need to do something with that, anything. It's just so cool. A lot of times I have like a general concept. Last year I had, I was just like thinking about florals. I had this floral thing going, and everything was floral in my brain. And so I had this thought of having like a sock pattern with all over florals. And I tried out all these new charts. I was looking up all these ideas, like trying to think about what it was that I wanted. And then finally I was like, I've written a book about this. Maybe I should look in my book. And I opened up alternate and I found a stitch pattern, a motif that I was like, there it is. Okay. So then I just used a motif from my own book and made a new pattern, which is something even I do. So sometimes it's just like I have a concept and then it gets clarified when I see the motif that I think is going to work. More often than that, though, it's like I have a concept and then I swatch and I'm like, and then I swatch again, and eventually it kind of gets refined into the thing, the bigger idea. And then I'll write the numbers and do all the math and then knit a whole sample. But even after the whole sample is knitted, like most of the time there's some kind of big-ish change that I want to make. That means that I need to like make another sample. So a lot of times the first full sample is actually a prototype. So it's most of the time my original concept does not end up being the same. So like that's one thing I like about independent design and things where I haven't necessarily like submitted an idea to a publication, because as I work through my ideas, a lot of times they change a lot. And so if I have a sweater where I'm like, okay, it's going to use this kind of shaping, it's going to have this kind of construction, it's going to have this motif here, I write a description and I send it to a publication for approval. And then they say, we love that design. And then I come back and I start working on it. And I'm like, oh, you know what? I don't actually like that motif in this. So it is like a little bit more independent and freeing to be able to, and it pays much better to do it independently. So yeah, I would say most of my designs get reworked. They're not what I originally had in mind.
I've heard you talking about hiking and biking and being outdoorsy kind of person, but you also love photography, and your Instagram is full of beautiful pictures of wildlife and nature. Is that part of the design process? Like when you go out and you have your camera, do you think in terms of color work?
Yes, both literally and in a much more woo-woo kind of a way. Being outside in general is very restorative, I would say, for me. Like when we go on hikes or bike rides, that renews just my general sense of everything, and it feels refreshing. And so then I feel like I'm more ready to be creative because my mind is less frantic, I guess. And so I can focus on being creative. So that's the kind of like health side of it, like a general well-being side of it is very important to my creativity. I do not subscribe to the like suffering artist idea. I think an artist myself, I create my best work when I am like in a peaceful state of mind where I'm like able to be creative without being afraid. So that's really important. But also one thing that the photography does for me is it helps me to practice looking for detail and thinking about things in these like, what part of this is drawing me in? Like, what is it about this scene that is interesting? Because when you're framing a photograph, like you can take a picture of anything, and even if it's like overall, oh, this is such a beautiful scene, if there isn't something that's drawing your interest, the photograph is boring and not worth, like people just will flip right past it. So when I am taking photos, I'm looking in a way that I think is a really important practice for creative people to just like look at things. And I walk really slowly. So that is also part of it. Like we go at botany pace is what we've heard it called. Which means like you stop and look at every plant.
It's usually what drives my children absolutely insane because I'm walking around and taking picture of every pretty flower and
well, it is hard to find the right partner for botany pace walks because if you're not both on board or everybody's not on board with that goal for the walk, it can be frustrating for everyone. But I do tend to walk very slowly. I look for details, and that really helps me to refine my the creative muscles that are like able to see those details. And that's definitely part of my design work, is thinking about like each individual detail and like how will the motifs interact with each other, or what about like the shaping and the the construction and all of those things, like those kind of details. So it's a part of my practice. So and the photography is just like enjoyable, and I love being in nature and I love sharing that. And it's really nice to me that I've been able to sort of cultivate a group of people who also want to see not just knitting, but do enjoy, I think, my nature photography and videos and things like that. So.
Well, one thing that intimidates me personally about color work more often than not is choosing colors. Like I can knit anything that's patterned, like no problem. Picking colors, it's really sort of agonizing. Do you have an advice on how to approach colors in color work?
Yeah, my first advice is it's sort of based on what your goal is, but if you are trying to get your color work to look like it pops and like you can see it, that is one of the biggest challenges, I think, about when people are choosing colors. They'll come up with two beautiful colors that look gorgeous together. They knit them, and then like you're like, what am I looking at? It's like the contrast is not high enough a lot of times. And I think color and color choice is very personal, and I love for people to choose colors based on emotion and what makes them feel the way they want to feel in that moment. But I would say my top tip for people who want their color work to really show up is one very light color and one very dark color. So they can even be a monochrome, navy blue, baby blue, or they can be totally different, pink, like pale pink, and like a dark brown. But having one very pale color and one very dark color is really, really helpful, because the only, like, having subtle color work, it can be a design choice, but it's much more challenging to get that to look good. Whereas having really high contrast is almost always going to look good. And I think what colors you choose, like what shades, that being blue or yellow or whatever, what shades you choose is less important than the value. Because a lot of times what people are doing is they're choosing two medium tone yarns, and they just disappear into each other. And the trick to figuring out if your yarns have a high enough contrast before you even start knitting is take a black and white photo, and your phone probably has like several different black and white filters. I would try several of them. Take a few black and white photos, and if you can tell the difference between the colors in the black and white photo, you're probably good to go. But if they both look medium gray, then they're probably going to look like nothing together. And my favorite example of this is I bought this neon green. It was like the hottest green I've ever seen in my life. But it was kind of like acidy, darkish neon green. And then I had a very, very pale gray. And I was like, these look nothing alike. And so I started knitting color work with them. I'm like, neon green doesn't show up on gray? Nope. So if I had taken a photo first, I would have seen that the pale gray was like a pretty light gray in black and white, and the neon green was like barely any different. It was just a tiny bit darker shade of gray in the black and white photo. So that's usually what's going wrong. It's not necessarily that your taste is not good enough. Like, I would say go with your taste. Even if other people don't like it, if somebody's like, oh, that's ugly, who cares? It's your taste. And I think that is thing that's really valuable about being our own creative people, is that we get to use our own taste. Doesn't matter what other people think. But if you have a light and a dark, then you're much more likely to be happy with the color work rather than just happy with the colors.
Right. Well, I'm going to put all the information about how people can get this book. And I don't often advise on book purchases. I highly recommend this one because I feel like it's a great resource for all the color work enthusiasts out there. Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you for sharing your story with me and my viewers. And thank you for being my guest today.
Thank you. That was such a lovely chat. I'm glad we got to dive into philosophy of design and originality a little bit. That was cool.
Thank you. Thank you.